Laughter wasn't supposed to sound like that. Not here. Not behind those doors. Naira Voss slowed as she approached the Alpha King's chambers, the tray in her hands steady, balanced, practiced. She had done this 100 times before. Entered quietly, left unnoticed, but tonight, the sound stopped her. Soft laughter, low, intimate, and then his voice. Her? Valor said, amusement threading through every word. She's useful, in her own way. Naira didn't move, didn't breathe. The words slipped under the door like something alive, something meant to find her. A second voice followed, a woman's. Light, curious, cruel, and she believes she matters? A pause. Just long enough for something fragile to rise. Before it shattered, I've never given her a reason to think that. The tray didn't fall. Her hands didn't shake. Nothing broke. Not outwardly. Naira stood there, still as the stone beneath her feet, her fingers tightening just slightly against the cool metal edge. Because he was right. That was the part that settled deepest. He had never promised her anything. Never said the words she had quietly built meaning around. Never claimed her. Never needed to. And yet, she had stayed. In the silence. In the in-between moments. In the spaces where his attention lingered just long enough to feel like something more. That had been enough for her. Enough to believe she wasn't invisible. Enough to forget her place. Inside the room, the woman laughed again. Soft. Satisfied. Naira didn't wait to hear more. She stepped back. Carefully. Quietly. The same way she always moved through the palace. Unnoticed. Only this time. It wasn't survival. It was choice. Because something inside her had gone still. Not broken. Not shattered. Just finished. And for the first time since she had entered this place. Naira Voss didn't feel like staring. Naira didn't go back to her room immediately. She walked. Not fast. Not aimlessly. Just forward. Through corridors she knew too well. Past doors she had learned not to linger near. Through spaces where she existed but never belonged. Nothing had changed. The palace was the same. The silence familiar. But something in her had shifted. Irreversibly. She stopped near one of the tall windows overlooking the courtyard, the cool glass reflecting a version of herself she barely recognized. Quiet. Composed. Untouched. As if she hadn't just heard something that should have broken her. But it hadn't. Not the way it should have. Because the truth didn't shock her. It settled. Like something that had been waiting beneath everything else. Naira had never been meant for this place. No lineage. No influence. Just a girl brought in under circumstances no one cared to remember. Given a role. A space. A purpose that didn't require acknowledgement. And then, there was him. Valor Draven. He hadn't been kind. Not in the way stories made men like him kind. But he had been attentive. In small ways. The kind that didn't mean anything. Until they did. The way his gaze would pause on her, just long enough to be noticed. The way he allowed her into rooms others weren't permitted to enter. The way his presence seemed to shift when she was near, subtle, controlled, but there. He never said anything. Never crossed a line. But he didn't create distance either. And Naira, she had filled that silence herself. Built meaning where none had been given. Believed attention was the same as intention. That had been her mistake. Not trusting him, but trusting what she thought she saw. She exhaled slowly, her reflection steadying. Because now, there was nothing left to misinterpret. He hadn't lied, hadn't misled her. He had simply never seen her the way she had seen him. And for the first time, Naira allowed herself to accept it. Completely. Without resistance. Without hope. Naira didn't return to the chamber doors. She didn't need to. The words had followed her anyway. She's useful. She knows her place. They echoed without sound, settling into places that had once held something softer. Something she didn't recognize anymore. She reached her room slowly, closing the door behind her with the same quiet care she always used. Nothing inside had changed. The bed, the small table, the few belongings she owned. Everything remained exactly as it had been. But now, it looked different. Simpler. Temporary. Like something that had never been meant to last. Naira set the tray down, her movements precise, controlled. No wasted motion. No hesitation. She stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. Not thinking. Just letting the truth settle. He hadn't betrayed her. That thought came first. Clear. Undeniable. Valor hadn't promised her anything. Hadn't given her a title. Hadn't claimed her in any way that meant permanence. He had offered space. Access. Nothing more. Everything else. She had created. That realization didn't hurt in the way she expected. There was no sharp edge. No overwhelming wave. Just a quiet understanding. Heavy. Final. She crossed the room slowly, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface of the table, the chair, the edges of a life she had built without questioning its foundation. And now, she saw it clearly. She had been living inside something that didn't belong to her. Something that could disappear the moment it stopped being convenient. And it had. Not in action, but in truth. Naira sat down, her hands resting in her lap, steady. Because this time, she wasn't waiting for anything to change. It already had, and for the first time since she had entered this palace. She stopped trying to make sense of it. Stopped trying to find meaning where none existed. Stopped hoping. The silence in the room felt different now. Not empty. Not heavy. Just clear. And in that clarity, Naira understood exactly what she needed to do. Naira didn't cry. That was the first thing she noticed. No tightening in her throat. No burning behind her eyes. Just stillness. She sat there for a long time, her gaze unfocused, her thoughts no longer chasing answers that didn't exist. Because there was nothing left to question. Nothing left to misunderstand. Everything had already been made clear. Slowly, she stood. The room felt smaller now. Not suffocating. Just temporary. Like a place she had stayed in longer than she should have. Naira moved quietly, her hands steady as she began to gather her things. There wasn't much. A few dresses. Personal items she had collected over time. Nothing of real value. Nothing that truly belonged to this place. She paused once, her fingers brushing over the edge of the table where she had spent countless quiet evenings, waiting for something she could no longer name. That version of her, the one who had waited, felt distant now, almost unfamiliar, because waiting required hope. And she didn't have that anymore. Not for this. Not for him. The thought didn't hurt. It settled. Like something finally put to rest. Naira crossed the room again, folding what she needed with careful precision. No rush. No hesitation. Because this wasn't escape. It was decision. A quiet one. But final. Outside, the palace remained as it always was, unaware, unmoved, continuing in its rhythm without pause. No one would notice. No one would question. She had made sure of that long ago. Invisible when needed. Forgettable when necessary. No! It worked in her favor. Naira glanced around the room one last time. Not searching, not lingering, just acknowledging. This had never been hers, and she no longer wanted it to be. She reached for her cloak, pulling it around her shoulders, the fabric settling into place like something familiar. Grounding. Then she turned toward the door. And this time, there was no hesitation at all. The palace was quiet before dawn. It always was. Guards rotated in low voices. Servants moved like shadows. Everything softened in that hour between night and morning. It made leaving easier. Naira stepped into the corridor without sound, the small bundle in her hand light enough to carry without effort. She didn't look around, didn't check for witnesses, because no one was looking for her. No one ever had. Her steps were steady as she moved through familiar paths, each turn instinctive, each hallway committed to memory long ago. She had walked these routes countless times, always staying within the lines, always knowing where she was allowed to be. Tonight, she walked past them. No hesitation, no second thought. The main door stood ahead, tall and silent, the guards stationed there barely glancing in her direction as she approached. Why would they? She wasn't leaving anything important behind, and she wasn't taking anything that mattered. Naira slowed only once, at the threshold, not to reconsider, just to feel it. The shift, from something contained to something unknown. The air outside was colder, sharper, real. She stepped through, and just like that, the palace was behind her. No alarms, no calls after her, nothing to mark her absence. The doors closed quietly. Final. Naira adjusted her cloak, pulling it closer as she moved forward into the dim light of early morning. There was no destination waiting, no certainty, only distance. And that was enough, because staying would have meant continuing something that had already ended. Leaving meant choosing herself for the first time. She didn't look back, didn't pause, didn't question it, because some decisions don't need to be reconsidered. They just need to be followed through. And Naira, finally, did. Valor noticed it in the smallest way. Not absence, not at first, just disruption. A pause where something should have been seamless. He stood in his chambers, waiting without realizing he was waiting. The morning had begun as it always did. Same routine, same structure, but something didn't align. The tray hadn't arrived. That was the first detail. Minor, forgettable, easily dismissed. Except it wasn't. Valor's gaze shifted toward the door, his expression tightening just slightly. "Where is she?" he asked, the question leaving him before he fully thought it through. The servant nearest him hesitated, only for a second. But Valor noticed. "She hasn't been seen this morning, Your Majesty." The answer was careful, too careful. Valor didn't respond immediately, because something in the room had already shifted. Find her. The command was quiet, controlled, but it carried. The servant bowed quickly and left. Valor turned away, dismissing the moment as nothing more than a disruption in routine. She would be found. She always was. Time passed, longer than it should have. The servant returned, alone. "There's no sign of her, Your Majesty." That was unexpected. Valor's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. When was she last seen? Another pause. "Last night, near your chambers." The memory surfaced immediately. Laughter. A voice not meant for her. His own words casual, unmeasured. She's useful. Valor went still. Not outwardly, but something beneath the surface tightened. "You're certain?" he asked. "Yes, Your Majesty." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just different. Because now, the absence had a shape, a reason, and for the first time, Valor didn't dismiss it. He understood it. Not completely. Not yet, but enough. Enough to know this wasn't routine, wasn't temporary. She hadn't been misplaced. She had left. And that was something he hadn't expected. The memory didn't leave him. It lingered. Quiet. Persistent. Unavoidable. Valor stood alone in his chambers, the same space where nothing had seemed out of place the night before. No. It felt different. Not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. He could still hear it. The laughter. The conversation. His own voice, detached, amused, certain. She's useful in her own way. At the time, it had meant nothing. A passing remark. A truth he hadn't needed to examine. No. It replayed differently. Slower. Clearer. He heard it the way someone else would have. The way she would have. Not strategy. Not distance. But dismissal. Final. Valor exhaled slowly, his gaze unfocused. Because the more he thought about it, the more something didn't sit right. Naira had never overstepped, never demanded attention, never acted as if she was more than what she had been given. She had existed within the boundaries he allowed, quietly, efficiently, without expectation. And yet, he had spoken about her as if she were nothing more than a convenience, something interchangeable, replaceable. That thought didn't settle well, not because it was untrue, but because of how it sounded now. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the door, half expecting, for a moment, to see her there, waiting, like she always had been, silent, present. But the doorway remained empty. And that was new. Valor frowned slightly, his mind shifting through details he had never paid attention to before. The way she anticipated his needs before he voiced them. The quiet efficiency of her presence. The absence of disruption when she was near. Things that had made everything easier. He had never questioned it, never examined it. Because it had always been there, until it wasn't. The realization didn't hit all at once. It settled, gradually, uncomfortably, because for the first time, Valor understood something he hadn't considered before. It wasn't what she had been to him. It was what she had quietly done, that he could no longer ignore. Naira didn't stop moving until the palace disappeared. Not just from sight, but from thought. That took longer. The first days were simple, not easy, but clear. Find shelter, find work, stay unnoticed. The same rules she had always lived by. Only now, they belonged to her, not to a place, not to him. The world beyond the palace didn't care who she had been. There were no titles here, no expectations, just survival. And strangely, that felt lighter. Naira settled in a small village at the edge of a trade route, the kind of place people pass through without asking questions. She found work quickly. Nothing complicated, nothing permanent, but enough. Enough to build something steady, something hers. Days turned into routine. Work in the mornings, quiet evenings, no interruptions, no waiting, no watching doors for someone who might or might not enter. And slowly, the silence changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. She noticed it one evening, standing outside as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky stretching wide and open in a way the palace walls had never allowed. Her chest didn't tighten. Her thoughts didn't drift back. There was no pull, no lingering expectation, just stillness. Real stillness. The kind she had never allowed herself to feel before. Because before, silence had meant absence. Now, it meant space. Space to exist. To breathe. To choose. Naira exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing as something inside her finally settled into place. She didn't miss the palace. Didn't miss the role she had once filled. Didn't miss him. Not in the way she had expected to. Because what she had felt before hadn't been real in the way she thought it was. And now, she didn't need it to be. She turned back toward the small home she had built for herself. Not grand, not permanent, but enough. For now, that was all she needed. The chamber felt colder now. Valor stood where he had stood countless times before, the same walls surrounding him, the same silence pressing in. But it wasn't the same. Nothing had changed. And that was the problem. He moved slowly, his gaze drifting across the room, landing on details he had never cared to notice before. The placement of objects. The quiet order of everything around him. Things that had always been handled. Without instruction. Without acknowledgement. By her. Valor exhaled quietly, the sound heavier than it should have been. Because now, there was no one anticipating his needs. No one moving through the space without drawing attention. No one there at all. The absence wasn't loud. It didn't demand recognition. But it stayed. Constant. Unrelenting. He turned toward the door again. That same brief expectation flickering through his mind. That she might be there. Waiting. Like she always had been. But the doorway remained empty. Because she wasn't waiting anymore. And for the first time, he understood why. The memory surfaced again. Clearer now. Sharper. She's useful. The words sat differently this time. Not casual. Not harmless. But careless. Dismissive. Cruel in a way he hadn't intended, but had still been. Valor lowered his gaze slightly, something unfamiliar settling beneath the surface of his usual control. Not regret. Not fully, but something close. Because he hadn't lost her in that moment. He hadn't driven her away with a single sentence. He had done it slowly. Every time he failed to see her. Every time he allowed her presence to remain unexamined. Every time he chose not to define what she was to him. Until she defined it for herself. And left. The room remained silent. Unchanged. Unforgiving. Because nothing here could replace what had quietly existed before. And now, there was nothing left to overlook. Nothing left to misunderstand. Only absence. And the weight of it.